we got to get to the Florida Panthers. They're moving on to the Stanley Cup Final, completing the sweep of the Carolina Hurricanes yesterday. How should Winnipeg Jet fans feel right now watching Paul Maurice get what he's getting out of this team that just snuck into the playoffs with a worse record than Winnipeg did and is now 4 wins away from winning the Stanley Cup?
Well, the good news is that whatever narrative you want to gain from it, you can go with it. Because
True.
There's honestly, I've seen so many people with so many different takes and all in different directions too. And none of them are really wrong, which is kind of the funny part. Like you have the pro Mauricers taking a victory lap around everybody right now. You have, maybe people that were in the anti-Maurice camp say, well, when your goalie gets a 980 over the course of a conference fight, you're probably going to win that series more often than not. I mean, you can go all over the place, but I think, I don't know, you can feel however you want. I like Paul Maurice. I would say this doesn't make him an elite coach in the NHL, but he's a nice dude. And I had the chances I've had to talk with him, I've, come away kind of rooting for him. So I'm not going to be upset or anything like that if the Panthers go on and win the Stanley Cup, or even if they don't. But at the same time, it's just interesting how I guess more so the danger of trying to narrow down a complete statement, like affirm this is the reason why the Panthers are where they are right now. Because the reality of the situation is, if a dysfunctional Penguins team finds a way to beat 2 of the worst hockey teams in the NHL this year, the narrative completely does a 180 on Paul Maurice, on Sergei Bobrovsky, on Matthew Tkachuk, on down and down and down the list. I mean, Zito as well, the GM there, right? Like, I mean, they were so close to not even being in the dance to get in there. And then we have, the Game 5 comeback. We have the Game 7 Bruins meltdown. And there's so many, right? Like, so I'm not going to make some big sweeping declaration one way or the other, because let's face it, hockey is the most random sport out there, and a bounce or two here or there, and we do complete 180s on coaches and players' legacies and different things like that. But he's doing a good job out there. I mean, let's face it. You take down the top 3 teams in the East, you're obviously doing something right. But I would, probably if we're looking to allocate some praise and a bigger reason as to why the Panthers are where they are right now. I mean, number one is your goaltender is putting forth a legendary performance. And when goalies put forth legendary performances through 3 consecutive series, this is generally what happens. And then you have a superstar in Matt Tkachuk just being, I mean, you're talking about a guy that was labeled a playoff unperformer coming into this season. Even more than Paul Maurice. I don't know if there's anybody that's done a 180 or bolstered their reputation more than Matthew Tkachuk, who just scores the biggest goals at the biggest possible times.
Well, and Calgary fans must be sick to their stomach. I mean, if you think back to the Battle of Alberta last year, what was it, 9-6 in the first game? And then it was all Edmonton. And Tkachuk wasn't much of a factor in the rest of that series. And he couldn't look any different right now, really putting this team on his back along with Bob and dragging them to the Cup final. And yes, that game where Pittsburgh lost at home to Chicago, I was just looking at the goal that won it for the Blackhawks. Do you know who scored it? Buddy Robinson.
Oh,
Buddy Robinson back in the NHL. Back in the NHL. And then, I mean, I was talking about this at the start of the show, but you think that, so Florida gets in. Florida beats Boston. Florida then knocks the Leafs out, which puts that entire team into turmoil. Dubas is out, and Dubas may end up managing the Pittsburgh Penguins, who would have been in if they could have just beaten the Blackhawks in that game. I mean, you talk about a lot of randomness. It is almost like a magic carpet ride, but we see this happen over and over with different teams. Maybe not always from the 8th hole like the Panthers have done, but they are doing that. And I'll say this about Maurice. I think what's happening right now with the Panthers, and part of it is the players that they have on the club, but this team is buying into his message. I saw a great thing, and I talked about it a little earlier. Mike Kelly broke it down about how often and how few times that the Panthers would dump the puck in last year and how often they wouldn't even dump the puck out for safety in their own ends. Both of those numbers have gone way up this year under Paul Maurice, but a big part of it is that come playoff time, you have to do that. And they did that more through the regular season, more prepared to do it. And the bottom line is when they are dumping it in, they are winning puck battles. And so much of it, Brandon, I mean, you can break it down, but it's one-on-one a lot of times. Who's winning that puck? Who's keeping the puck? And the Florida Panthers are doing a hell of a good job of it. And when they have it, they're making the most of their chances, far better than their opponents who have to get through Bob.
Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to how fickle coaching can be at the NHL level, because I know that the Maurice tenure didn't end super well here in Winnipeg, but were the 2018 Winnipeg Jets not looking a whole lot like these Panthers right now?
Oh, yeah.
Like, I mean, the Jets were, which is just, it's wild to think about, but a large group of this team right now in Winnipeg bought into Paul Maurice, and they weren't able to have a ton of success, and they were an absolute force to be reckoned with. But the message, or I don't know if the message got stale or it just wasn't being received, whatever the reason was, but you kind of see things, turn into a bit of a tailspin in the last couple of seasons there. And then obviously the change with Maurice going over to Florida. So, I mean, he's proven that he can do a good job if he's able to get a group to buy into the message. The intriguing part with Maurice looking back at his tenure is that, when people would always say the win-loss thing, was that he never got goaltending. And wouldn't you know it, that he didn't get goaltending in the first half of his coaching career, maybe the first 2/3, but then he ends up with Connor Hellebuck and then an all-time Hall of Fame performance from Sergei Bobrovsky here right now. So he's getting it in spades. And that's the other funny part of this too, Huss, is that, you could point to it, like I said there, and say, hey, Florida was insanely lucky to have Pittsburgh blow it in the final 2 games of the season. But then you could flip right around and say, well, the Panthers were one of the best analytical teams throughout the entire regular season. They were unlucky not to be in a more fortunate spot. So you can go all over the place here. And again, like I said earlier, whatever narrative you believe in, you probably have some facts and some data to back it up, which is just hilarious and makes for great sports talk.
Very malleable topics right now.
Yeah, but it also, I mean, if you're looking almost from more of a macro perspective, the Panthers, even with all the departures they had the previous offseason, and again, kind of shows the importance of having elite high-end talent at important positions, where you have your number one center in Barkov. You have, Tkachuk's a unicorn, basically, as impactful as a number one center out there on the wing. And then they've got 2 number one defensemen as well out there in Florida. So, that's, to me, when I look at why the Panthers are where they are, a bunch of different factors. But let's face it, too, this isn't your normal 8 seed that snuck in on the last day of the postseason. This was, I don't know what the opposite of a paper tiger is, but that's what the Florida Panthers were once they were able to get into the dance here, and they're doing the 2012 Kings dance right now.
Well, and it's funny. I'll give Jack Hand credit, that former assistant coach with the Leafs that does a lot of interesting stuff online. He said before it, this is a bad matchup for the Boston Bruins. This is going to be a real test. Now that being said, if Brad Marchand scores in the final 2 seconds of Game 5 on that clear-cut breakaway up 3-1. The Bruins move on, and history is entirely different. But he didn't, and from that moment on, they have caught lightning in a bottle. Tkachuk, back-to-back 40-goal seasons. His numbers this year: 79 games, 40 goals, 69 assists for 109 points, and 123 penalty minutes, which you don't often see triple digits right now in the NHL. I had this conversation last night watching the game with some of my buddies, and our pal Greg from Royal dropped this one on me, and I've been thinking about it since last night, and I'm interested in what you think. If you had a redraft of the entire National Hockey League right now, Connor McDavid's obviously number 1. I don't think there's much dispute with that. Who's number 2? And how close is Matthew Tkachuk to being that guy? Think about 40 goals, 109 points, all the intangibles that he brings, and then everything else about the culture carrier. Like, who else is in the mix for that? We thought maybe like Cale Makar for sure.
Yeah.
Obviously, Nate McKinnon would be in the mix. But I mean, Matthew Tkachuk, I would have never thought of him as that sort of franchise player before, but it's pretty hard not to. I mean, he's already had the numbers, and now when it matters the most, he's elevating his game and doing things that, frankly, no one else, including Connor McDavid, wasn't able to do in their last round of the playoffs.
Yeah, I think he's vaulted himself into the best player in the world not named Connor McDavid discussion because McDavid's on a planet all on his own. But, I mean, you want to talk, I would say Makar, Draisaitl, McKinnon, Matthews, and Tkachuk. Like, those are, like, he's there. I don't know what I guess
there's
the order
a lot
of
of
that
GMs. I guarantee there's probably at least a handful of GMs that probably would actually have Tkachuk over a bunch of those guys that you just mentioned.
Yeah. Like you could make a case for any of the. I would probably have Makar too because he's just a complete freak. But man, it would be tough. Yeah. You could. I mean, that's I guess kind of the crazy thing is you can make a case for him being the second best player on the planet right now. I don't know if he is or not, but he's turned into an absolute manimal. Like he's just. He influences the game every single time he steps out on the ice, and he's one of the rare ones that. You know, I mean, for all of Draisaitl's insane offensive exploits, you know, he gives a fair bit back of the defensive end. I mean, obviously still enough to be one of the 3 or 4 best players on the planet, but, you know, Tkachuk does it everywhere. Like, there's no hole in his game. He's not a great skater, but he's, you know, good enough to get the job done. But, like, I mean, if you look at what he does out there, he is the new complete package. So, yeah. And it's just funny to think about how quickly legacies and stuff like that get turned around. Hey, Huss, where, you know, prior to this in Calgary, it was, can you get it done in the playoffs with Matthew Tkachuk? And it was very, very similar to Pavel Datsyuk, too, in Detroit. I would always make this argument when people would say Ehlers can't do this, he can't do that in the playoffs. Datsuk's, I think, first 19 playoff games, he had 5 points. And then ends up being what I would say is a Hall of Fame player, right? Like, so it also kind of lends to the notion that maybe don't make an assertion on somebody's legacy before they get into the back half of their career at the very least.
Well, I'm glad you brought Ehlers and the Jets into it because I did want to ask you. I mean, now that we've seen another couple rounds of the playoffs and seeing what Vegas has done to Edmonton and are doing to Dallas and where the Panthers are right now, when you look at the Winnipeg Jets and what they are, what we've seen them be in the past, and obviously where players are at right now, but I mean, first of all, you need to have a team that shows up and fights the way a team like Carolina did last night with their backs against the wall. And that obviously is a big concern. And a lot of people, myself included, still sort of bent at just how meekly they kind of went out in Game 5. And that's not the first time this happened. And that maybe is more an identity thing. But as far as a team being built, there's a lot of skill. There's a lot of scoring on the Winnipeg Jets. And they've had that for a while. There's a lot of things that they don't have. When you see these teams that are still battling, and let's assume that it's Vegas and Florida, what can we learn about those teams as to where the Winnipeg Jets need to tweak their roster, improve certain styles or qualities coming in if they want to be more competitive with the teams that are really legit cup contenders once we get to this point in the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much time you want to spend on this, but the number one is the thing that's the hardest to kind of, I guess, put a number on, and that's just the identity and the culture of the team. Like that's it. That's number one. They have the skill on the team. It's just there's something wrong with the mix that it doesn't work when the chips are down. And I think Carolina is a great example of that. I mean, they literally, because of their head coach and the way that they play, believe that they were still in this down 3-0. and they were, I mean, that is the tightest sweep you will ever see, I think, maybe in any sport, where Carolina, you know, in an alternate universe, might have found a way to sweep that series as well if a couple of bounces go their way. And I think what you see in Vegas too, where, you know, they take a malcontent, a guy that was almost a bit of a pariah in Jack Eichel, and he's doing the Matthew Tkachuk run out there in the Western Conference, where he's been the best player out there in the West all playoffs long after Game 1 against Winnipeg at the very least. So I mean that's got to be the first issue that's figured out. Then if you want to talk more so player personnel, and it's going to depend a lot too on the trade returns that the Jets get if they do ship out a number of their guys. But I guess the one thing that I've noticed, and I've said for a while now, that I think Winnipeg's really missing is the need to have a stud on the second pair. you can have it's mandatory to have that number one guy, that number one blue liner, and thankfully the Jets were able to find that in Josh Morrissey. But you really do. You look at these teams, you need to have that second piece behind him. Whether it's on the same pairing or on the one behind him that you can trust and lean on and know that, hey, through 40, 45, maybe even 50 minutes of a hockey game, we're going to have a guy that can carry the pace of play on the back end for us. I think that's one of the big pieces that the Jets have been missing really since Byfuglien left. Because when Byfuglien was there, they had enough behind him. Like they would have, Trouba and Morrissey as a pairing were able to, I think, elevate their level of play to something like that as a grouping, because Dustin Byfuglien was the big horse up front for them. And I think that's one of the main things this club is missing right now, is that they don't have somebody that can maybe not equal what Morrissey does on the back end, because he's very unique in terms of how he delivers value to the team, but to have a guy that you feel super, super comfortable with playing 25 minutes behind him. All those teams that are left have a guy like that, and it's pretty noticeable when you see Vegas and their duo with Pietrangelo and Theodore, and then even, both Florida and Carolina, but Florida having Montour and Ekblad. I think that is one of the pieces that the Jets, just taking a look at their current roster as it's constructed right now, they could find somebody like that to come in and step up for them. It would be a massive, massive step in the right direction.